Dive into the world of biomechanics and lever systems with the Crackin Backs Podcast, where our guests, the dynamic Bailey brothers, Dr. David and Dr. Christopher, explore the bio-lever system, the study of energy transfer from one body part to another through a joint, and is based on the human body's natural lever system. Learn how to unravel this unique approach to predict athletic outcomes, prevent injuries, and accelerate healing, setting it apart from conventional healthcare methods. This unique analysis ensures thorough scientific evaluation that muscle groups can be completely isolated during activities such as strength training and greatly reduce the stress and trauma to a joint. As a result, injuries and surgeries are dramatically reduced and or eliminated. Get inspired by real-life success stories where the bio-lever system has transformed health and improved quality of life. Tune into the Crackin Backs Podcast for your dose of science, health, and innovation, and learn how to leverage your body's mechanics for peak performance and recovery.
All right, so you know what? Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you guys on because I've known these two boys for quite a time. You've always made me laugh. You've always inspired me. So I can't wait to talk about some of the stuff we're doing because I always say, and we have two guests on at the same time, and they always say two brains are better than one, except in my condition, in my situation with my partner. That's why he'll be doing most of the talking. However, I did want to say thank you. I can't wait to talk about some of the concepts that you guys have been working on for decades, and kind of got my brain thinking about some stuff. So, welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Good to be here.
Thank you, Jerry.
So let's just kick this right off. And as chiropractors, we've always been told we had to adapt. You know, we have some chiropractors are 6'5", some they're barely 4'11". And yeah, we've always had to figure out how to make those adjustments when we have somebody walk in that's 4'1" versus 7 foot. So we've always been told about the lever system and how we have to so we don't hurt ourselves, make things work. But you guys took it to another twist, and you talked about training based off of length of bones and lever systems. So where did all that start?
Go ahead, Dave.
It started in 1994. We were at a large fitness expo in San Francisco. I go walking past the booth, and I said to myself, what is that? So I go talk to this gentleman. His name is Gerald. And I asked him, hey, what is this thing? Because it was a weird-looking setup. He said, well, this is designed to measure your lever lengths and angles and determine where your advantage in training. I said, you got to be kidding me. So he measured me, and then he told me everything I could do well athletically and things I could not do well, and he was 90% accurate. And I said, this is mind-blowing. So I went and grabbed my brother, Dr. Chris. I said, Chris, you got to check this out. This is off the freaking chart. So he did the same thing to my brother, measured him, told him everything he could do well athletically. Things he could not do was 90% accurate, and we were hooked.
Yeah, and then after that, we had him come out, Gerald Riley and his brother David Riley. They're the founders of this incredible science that they've been using for probably 35 years, and we were introduced to it again about 95, 94. So we got a unit, purchased a unit, got trained by them, and started to understand that everybody is different. Long torso, short torso, wide shoulders, narrow shoulders, short femurs, long femurs, and how this applies. And, you know, Archimedes said years ago, he said, give me the right lever and I can move the world. So the question then comes up, well, what if you don't have the right lever? And then athletically, we trained a lot of athletes like you guys, and, you know, you want to prevent injuries. So we had a linebacker come to us, and he never could quite squat. This is back in the 90s, late 90s. We bio-levered him. He had a long torso, long femur, and just immediately you could see the levers were not there that he could do a good squat. that stress left the muscles of the lower back, went to the lower back joints. And he started to have some real issues. So we biolevered him, we changed some stuff. And so 25 years later, a couple of hundred, 25,000 profiles later, we've got a lot of information about how to break down an individual, an athlete, so that they can maximize their performance and minimize their injuries. That's kind of how it all started.
So, well, I'll jump in and ask. You know, there were some things that I read up that I was curious about. If you could describe what structural strength zones are, and how did you determine that?
Very good. Okay, so everybody is measured from the central point, which is the sternal notch. And we're going to take 10 measurements. We're going to measure the length of the clavicle from the sternal notch, the height of the clavicle, the depth of the clavicle. We're going to then measure the elbow angle and elbow radius, your upper arm, lower arm, torso length, femur, and tibia. We sweep the lever arm and the resistant arm through their diameters, and we determine a point in space mathematically where they intersect, where the energy leaves the muscle and goes to joint, causing cumulative micro trauma. And everybody is different. I've got a little chart here. This is you probably can't see it, but it's a chart of my wife. And you'll see a green zone and a red zone. If I can zip in a little bit. The red zone shows the energy now in joint tissue. The green zone shows energy in muscle tissue. And that is different for everybody. Every one of us are different. And I sent Terry a little clip of Michael Phelps. Although I've never measured him, if you break him down, you can see he's got a tremendously high clavicle angle. He's got a very deep clavicle angle. So we know automatically that he's very advantaged in shoulder movements. Then he's got a long torso, which tells us that he's got great rotational power. Long femur, short tibia. So he's got tremendous ability in kicking. He was literally designed to swim. So that's kind of how we do that, Dave. Spencer, excuse me, Dr. Spencer.
When you get a chance, we would love to have an image, a clean image of that, so we could pop that on the screen while you're talking for the ones that are viewing on YouTube.
Okay.
So now the green zones, and how did you determine based on leverage? When does the muscle have the most influence over the range of motion versus the joint? Like, where does that, I mean, that sounds like physics, but I wouldn't know. How is that determined per person?
Dave, you?
Yeah, that's determined just on our anatomy. For instance, if somebody has a very shallow clavicle angle, they're not advantaged to bring the bar all the way down to the chest. So, like Dr. Chris said, we're all built differently, and that's why a lot of the exercises that athletes do are actually causing them more problems than it is actually helping them. And so that's why we can take this information and make adjustments to their training protocol to help them so they're not traumatized in the weight room versus being traumatized in the field.
A lot of athletes try to do what the coaches ask. And inevitably, so many suffer some cumulative micro trauma, especially to the low back is probably number one, shoulders number two, knee is number three in our experience. But so you're going to measure the length of the humerus, which means you have landmarks yet you have to identify. So we're going to identify about 10 landmarks on the body, which tells you got to know your anatomy. And so sweeping their lever arm and the resistant arm mathematically on a graph form shows us, Spencer, how you would be advantaged in movement. Okay?
So I bet the functional movement screening approach makes you cringe because it's so
It's pretty generic.
FMS. What's that?
It's pretty generic.
Yeah, that's what because this is what you're talking about is very specific.
A perfect example, Dr. Spencer, is we had an All-American quarterback in Northern California that had back surgery, and we measured him, and his squat depth literally was like 7 inches, and they were making him go down to parallel, which is 15, 16 inches, and so we did the analysis. We wrote a letter and said, listen, based on this athlete's profile, he cannot squat to where you want him to squat. So they allowed the change, and he went on to have a phenomenal season instead of another back surgery.
Yeah.
So this is very powerful.
You're learning to train your frame. Okay. And my greatest injuries were in high school. We had a great college high school coach. We'll call him Coach Tony. Dave, tell that story.
Tony Kim.
Yeah.
Yeah, my all-star football coach in high school was a very well-built gentleman. He played college football, and he had heard that we had this piece of equipment because he had one of his shoulders replaced. So we measured him, and he literally was 19 degrees to full extension, which means he had to stop 10 inches off his chest in the bench press. He had a very low clavicle angle. So as soon as his elbow went above that angle, it put stress on his shoulder. And I went and trained him in the gym and completely changed how he trained because he wanted to save his other shoulder.
Yeah.
So this is amazing information.
It's not that an athlete can't train it a particular way. It's what's the cost reward ratio, right? What and again, in the prevention aspect, you want to have these kids healthy later in life, 40, 50, 60, and avoid these problems. I'm 62, Dave's a little older, 64. No shoulder surgery, no back, no knee, and yet so many people break down over time and they end up having a shoulder issue or a back issue.
All right, I got a question. Actually, two-part. You got the kids you hear in college, especially the recruiters they recruiting more on genetics now than they are on how good you are in high school. Because if you can be the best outside hitter in volleyball, but if you're only 5'8", you're pretty much done. Do you ever have kids that you measure and they really want to go in this sport, and you're looking at their measurements going, you're never going to be really good in that sport? Have you ever thought of this sport would be a different option? Or do you ever see recruiters down the road looking at this type of information to recruit?
Well,
great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Mike Boyle, who was a renowned strength coach, he's mentioned it. Randy Huntington currently is the head track and field coach for China. Randy has had 45 years. He's a master jump coach. Anyway, we've had a couple of lunches, and Randy feels like this should be part of every coach's analysis. Every coach, strength coach, conditioning coach, you get a set of eyeballs and an understanding that you didn't have before, Terry. That's a great question. Had a baseball pitcher. He had a lot of potential. Coach wanted him to throw overhand. He had a 2-degree clavicle angle. He's going to have a 3/4 release out here. This, not good for him. Impingement issues. This, he felt really good. Generated some more miles per hour. So, that's a profound question. And with our kids, every time, so when you start measuring an athlete is when they start growing, let's say at about age 12. Each growth spurt, you reevaluate, okay? Because their levers change. Once you're done growing, don't have to really have another measurement. So if you're an adult, it's one time only. If you're a child, a growth spurt, you're gonna follow up.
A perfect example, Dr. Terry, is Dr. Chris was a phenomenal college baseball player, but they had him in the wrong position. He had a long femur, short tibia, and they had him catching. that was the worst position for his genetics he could be. He should have been a second baseman or third baseman, and no telling how he would have ended up. But yes, we can use the information we get. Say, listen, you're not suited for this position. You're much more suited for that position.
We had a defensive back who had a short femur, long tibia. He played at corner. So these guys can't backpedal well. So what does he do? He naturally wants to turn his hip and be a sprinter because your sprinters have short femurs, long tibias. So how you would attack that individual. In fact, Gerald and David were asked to do an analysis of a professional hockey team. They biolevered every athlete on this professional team, never having watched them play hockey before. And they could absolutely tell the coach which player played which position based on their anatomy and their structure. And they were forced to sign a waiver saying, please don't disclose this information because we would know how to attack this team based on that. So great question. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you should have been around when I was younger because, I had the brain that said I can try anything and the body said, fuck you. And so I would, I'd try to do flips and I would come out halfway through and smash my body. So it's probably just because I was genetically could not do a flip. So,
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
We're all different.
Yeah.
Interesting. There's apparently some merit to this, or a lot of merit to this, because I remember Coach Parcells would look at players in their positions, and he would say, "Oh yeah, he's going to be a good, halfback or running back, short arms, short neck," and he would go through their dimensions, and I would think, "Wow, that's interesting how he already in his head instinctively profiled patients." Players' anatomy based on their position in football.
And Dr. Spencer, that's a great point. They've been doing this for quite some time, but there never has been a system that you can reproduce with accuracy these angles and these measurements and then apply that to rehab, to performance, to prevention, and just daily lifestyle.
Here's a perfect example, Dr. Spencer. Dr. Chris and I, back in the early 90s, we evaluated 8 BYU football players that were headed for the NFL Combine. Now, they were 6 months after their season, right? So they should have been healthy. We went through their muscle testing of upper and lower extremities. They averaged 5 muscle weaknesses in their lower extremities and 7 in their upper. None of these players ended up getting drafted. My point is, why was their body so beaten down? It's because they were doing the training by the strength coaches, the bench press, the squats, and all these exercises that a lot of them were not advantaged to do. And consequently, their bodies were still beat up when they went into the NFL Combine. So by making a little bit of changes here and there, it could have drastically changed that.
I have a hypothetical, or really it's a real clinical case that I have a question that when you're measuring length of bones and their angles, and I'm wondering there are some athletes, especially when the FMS thing was a hot item for strength and conditioning coaches, because it gave them a recipe. And they thought that recipe applied to everybody. So, it made it a no-brainer thing. But they took one of the players and they said, no, you need to be squatting like this. Now, his feet would be positioned, that you're looking at the bottom of feet, let's say, and his feet would be positioned like this. Now, would that be something that you would be able to identify as to why that was comfortable for him? But they made him do this, and he ended up with hip injury.
Well, having been an assistant strength coach for a couple of years, and then I was on the board for 3 years for the CSCCA, I think in general, a good squat position is feet shoulder width apart, toes slightly externally rotated 5 to 10 degrees, allowing for that hip sink, that hip motion. Toes forward, really is not a natural position for that squat procedure. Some say, well, you can emphasize the quads more by doing that. I don't know that. We know that very few people have the mechanical leverage to do a squat below 90.
Well, actually, what ended up happening with that particular athlete, and I think happens a little more often than we think, is there's such a phenomenon that, I mean, we're like you guys said, we're not the same from one side to the other. I mean, we're very asymmetrical, but we think we're symmetrical. He had retroversion of the femoral neck into the acetabulum. So, his retroversion, and so that's why he had to angle his foot out to one side, and then the other hip was normal.
Yeah.
Would that be something that the bilever system could identify as to why, or an X-ray? Simply an X-ray would identify that.
Taking an X-ray, looking at the hip socket, the joint, the angles. Biolever is going to measure that femur length, tibia length, torso length. It's going to, in a movement, you want balance. So it's really going to determine a structural balance range of motion for everybody.
So functionally, it will determine our squat depth and how far the athlete can bend forward before they get an energy transfer into the lumbosacral joint. So we're looking at squat depth and torso deflection.
We call it a torso deflection, but it's flexion of the torso forward, right? And sometimes you see people squatting and they're doing a back squat. Their torso is completely like this. And from a chiropractic point of view, when that happens, the nucleus is going to be thrown back. So really controlling that angle and squat depth based on your frame is, we find it invaluable.
So you mentioned, and I was really ready to toss the question out about deflection range and what do you mean by that? And how does that apply to, let's say, a squat?
Okay, go ahead. So in measuring the torso and the femur, that's going to give you a range as to your ability of the torso to bend forward, backward, laterally bend, right and left, and rotate right and left. Okay, so rotational athletes typically are very advantaged in a torso deflection range, which means they have great power. All right, baseball, tennis, golf guys. We've had some professional golfers having lower back injuries. In their analysis of these guys, they were bending too far forward. And in 18 holes, a guy's hitting right to left 450 times. So what did we do? We lengthened their club.
Yeah, that's right.
Brought them to an upright position, took the stress off the low back. Okay? And there are some guys who, well, I'd say maybe 25% who are disadvantaged in that flexion movement, which means if you're under 30 degrees, you're really not advantaged in that particular movement. So in baseball, these are the guys that naturally hit balls to right field, right center. They're not going to be a pole hitter. Pole hitters have tremendous rotational. They've got good ratios, and they're going to be very quick in that movement of rotation.
Fascinating.
So how we would train those athletes, Dr. Spencer, we would have them go through a nice full motion if they're going to use the squat with 50% less of their 1 RM. They can go through a full range of motion, but as soon as they start loading that with higher than 50%, we stay in their advantage range of motion. So they get the neurological pattern and movement of a full range of motion, but say their squat depth is 9 inches, we'll keep them in that 9-inch range when they're doing heavier loads.
And we might shift them. I had a college linebacker just recently that his dad called me up and he said, never been able to squat since high school. 6'2", 6'3" athlete, phenomenal, right? Always has back pain when squatting. So I biolevered him. Long torso, long femur, not advantaged in squat depth, in squatting in general. So what did I do? His squat depth was about 11 inches. I put him on a belt squat. So we put the resistance on the hip, took the back out of the equation. Boom, had a phenomenal year. And more importantly, did not irritate the back.
Question. Then how is it, and maybe you can explain it, I don't know. Sometimes we'll put a patient with a 2x4 under their heels, and suddenly they have no pain and they can squat better. What's happening there?
You're giving their tibia 2 inches longer length.
You're lengthening the tibia.
So you're creating either an even segment or a short long. So you're just giving them a 2 inch longer tibia.
You're changing that lever. And that's why people do it. And they love it. Put a little plate underneath. Gosh, I can sink down. I feel better. My torso's better. That's exactly, you're lengthening the tibia.
That is so cool. That explained like 40 years worth of curiosity as to why that helps with some people and not with others.
Docs, when we got bio-levered back in 96, 97, listen, David had a great understanding of anatomy, functional anatomy. I did. I was, we were both exercise science guys, and I was a strength coach at a college, assistant for a couple of years. We thought we knew a little bit. And when we got bio-levered, it ruined our paradigm. I mean, it's like, what? But it explained a lot of things.
Yeah.
And we started to make these changes, and it's like, it was like light bulbs went on and performance improved. So that was really a great event back when that happened.
What about somebody who's been playing at a pro level for 12 or 13 years, and you're gonna bio-lever them or measure? Let's take a pitcher, for example. We just recently rehabbed one. How would you determine why all of a sudden, maybe they would have a forearm injury if they're a closer and it's like near the end of the or midway in that inning, and they're having like a continuous pain in the forearm? Where would you? I know this is arbitrary, but where would you look? How would you determine? And they've been playing ball professionally for 13
High
years.
level.
Yeah.
Well, here's obviously being in the chiropractic profession, you have to make sure neurologically they're sound, right? Cervical, thoracic.
Extremities.
Check the extremities, all the shoulder stuff, the elbow, the wrist. Look at the lower extremities as well, because throwing is a lot lower body, if not all. And then you have to look at his training, injuries, see what's gone on with him, scar tissue, fibrosis of repair, make sure you're addressing that. And then from a training aspect, bio-lever him. You might change the release point, even though he's been doing it for a long time.
Yeah.
Stride length. There's a couple of things that you might look at there. I had a professional NFL football player named Jason, All-American in college, played 7 years in the NFL, a couple of Super Bowl rings. We bio-levered him, and he said this: I would have paid $1 million to have had this information prior to all of this, because he literally broke his body down, not on the field.
In the weight room.
In the weight room. Broke his body down in the weight room, shoulder, knee, back, and he just said, wow, what this could have done for him.
Jeez. Well, yeah, no better time than now. Jeez. All right. So, by the way, you nailed it by what you said when you said look at the lower extremities, because the pain here.
Yeah.
We pulled up video watching him on the mound in the most recent in last year's games, and I was telling my associate doctor, I go, you know what? Check his ankle range of motion and his toe strength,
Yep.
because everything's coming from there. And if
Round
that's
up.
weak, yeah. So you were absolutely right. Check lower extremities. And by the way, he was getting treated throughout the season for that.
Wow.
And I thought, man. So they kind of gave you the answer, look somewhere else,
Yeah.
because it's obviously that's the weak link,
Correct.
but it's coming from somewhere else. It's pretty cool. So now, okay, so we talked about deflection range, and that was interesting. That would you call that when you're referring to the green zone and the red zone, is that applicable where the deflection range, once again?
Yeah, the advantage and disadvantage range.
Structural strength
Okay.
zones, mechanical zones of leverage. There's different terms you could use, but you want to stay in the green and avoid the red.
Yeah, okay. So now, would you tell somebody that wants to squat that that they have, what did you say, long torso, long tibia?
Femur.
Is that, no, femur, excuse me. Would you urge them to squat only in a like a quarter squat or a half squat, as we call it, or in that green zone? Is that what?
Great question. Dave will take this.
Dr. Spencer, this is what I'd say. If he's not an athlete, if he's not a strongman or competitive power lifter, I wouldn't have him squat, because we know that 90% of the population cannot squat to parallel and stay in their advantage range of motion. So that's number one. If he is a college athlete or pro athlete and he has to squat, you have him warm up. He can go through a nice range of motion on his warm up, but as soon as he starts adding any type of load, then he has to stay in his advantage range of motion. Otherwise, he's going to cause micro trauma, subluxation, more micro trauma, and then that joint is ready for failure. So we want him to stay in that advantage range.
And to add to that, my young son Joseph, who's 17 now, when he was 13, I started to introduce the squat movement, right? You introduce movement patterning before you do load. So I analyzed Joseph. I bio-levered him. We looked at his ability to squat. He could front squat better than he could back squat. Okay, so what I did with Joseph, he could stay in his structural mechanical strength zone in a front squat, but he could not in a back squat. So I elevated the bench. We had him come down to a bench as a touch point, and we front squatted for a while, and then to get the back part of the squat, I did a goblet squat. So we held a kettlebell dumbbell here, taking that back flexion out of the equation so he could get that, and we maintained a 10, 11-inch squat depth. So you could hit the muscle groups involved. I just don't want to cause some trauma to a young spine, especially with a compressive load.
So I'm more than excited to hear this and these modifications and what we have typically thought, everybody has to go full range with everything, because many years ago there was a concept in training called power factor training. I'm not sure if you ever heard of it, but there's a book on it, and it was popular, and I still do it to this day. And it is basically doing training in your strongest range. Now that sounds very generic, but everybody knows where their strongest range is, and it could be from here to here instead of from here to here with bench or squat. And I'll tell you, the whole concept is to go a little bit heavier with weight, and you completely avoid injury by compromising a joint and bringing it through its full range when not everybody has a biolever system, so
Right.
we're looking at how to apply principles of training in that range that you guys approve of, depending on your an analysis. What would someone do though if they can't get? I mean, I got to tell you, I've never heard of the biomechanical system. So how would somebody that evaluate themselves, or how would a chiropractor help, or a physical therapist or something, by if they don't have that system?
Yeah.
Go for
Well,
it.
I would just say a lot of guys in the process of trial and error over time do figure some things out, right? Unfortunately, there might be some injuries involved. But you could, for example, with a bench press, in the thousands of profiles that we've done, literally 10% of people can literally bring a bar down to their chest. Most of us cannot, okay? And you could start by looking at the depth of the clavicle. Just go to the sternal notch, find the AC joint, and then follow the clavicle back. There's a little point on the clavicle called the deltopectoral triangle. It's where the clavicle goes deep to horizontal. And you can literally, the humerus will rotate to the angle of the clavicle. So the deeper the clavicle,
The further his arm
the
can go
further
back.
my arm can go back. Typically, the larger the pec. And these guys are typically advantaged in that movement. They're a naturally strong bench presser. I'm working with collegiate athletes every week, 15 to 25. I had a guy come in the other day. I just looked at his depth angle. I said, man, you're a heavy bencher, aren't you? He goes, how'd you know? I had a lady come in. She was a swimmer. I just looked at her clavicle. I'd never seen her before. I figured, well, I had about 20 athletes around me. I said, let's see if I can guess her stroke. I got a 25% chance of maybe guessing something right. But I just looked at her clavicle angle, which is the clavicle to the AC joint, the sternal notch to the AC joint. That on that angle, she was very low. I said, you're a breaststroker. She goes, how did you know that? I says, because freestyle and butterfly and back's got to have a high angle to do that. Otherwise, they're going to have impingement. And impingement is the number one injury for shoulders, right?
Swimmers.
For swimmers, it's the number one injury. So you can start to just look at anatomy and get a ruler and protractor. Gerald Riley literally was the Arthur Jones of this. Gerald and David started this probably in the late 70s. He was an athletic trainer. His brother was an engineer. And they started this system of analyzing these people. We got certified from them. But he's like an Arthur Jones. I said, Gerald, he broke down an athlete that was just amazing. And we've, over the 30 years, learned from Gerald and David. But just start looking at people's anatomy.
All right, I got to jump in on this one. So in the clavicle, you've got let's take a fractured clavicle. So now they break it, and now it changes that angle, and then if they don't get surgery, it's gonna have one angle. If they do get surgery, they put that plate in there, and now it just totally changes all the range of motion, but it doesn't affect the other side. What adaptations do you make on those two scenarios?
Good question.
That's a great question.
So, a clavicle, if you break mid, it's really not going to affect the AC joint. It'll affect a lump here, calcium, callus, all that here. Really not going to affect that angle. You can look at the other angle as well. We're pretty symmetrical. We do have some asymmetries, okay? But it's really not going to change overall the angle from the sternal notch to the AC joint. It might change the depth angle a little bit, but I would look at the other side as well. It's a great question, Terry.
But it will change the way the clavicle rotates. So when you do bring that arm back, that clavicle has to rotate. It'll change that. So how do you make the adaptations to that? So, because now you're locking in that clavicle, and you're locking in either by the fracture healing, or you're locking in by a piece of metal. So you have to change the angles that they bench or change, because it's not rotating to keep up with the humerus anymore.
It's a great question. Injuries change everything. And at that point, you have to adapt. and really get a lot of feedback from the athlete as to what feels good.
And we'd have to actually see him in the movement, so we could look at him, go ahead and do a bench, and we could see what's doing here, what's happening here, and then we can make an adjustment.
Well, so you can change the route now. So like with any injury, you're going to adapt to the weakest point, but you can use that lever system. It probably helps quite a bit determining that pre and post.
Huge.
Yeah,
Huge in rehab.
In rehab.
Huge.
How do you guys determine what actually is a long femur, like or a long tibia? Like, what is it compared to the other body parts, or is there a standard?
So you're measuring the femur to the tibia. Mm-hmm. You're looking at the ratio, the length of the femur to the tibia. David has an even segment length. He's a 2-foot jumper. He was a great catcher. Squatting did not bother him. Tremendous leg drive. Even segment guys have different mechanical leverage than a guy. I'm long short. I'm a long femur short guy. Okay? So I could backpedal well, change of direction very well. I wasn't necessarily a Usain Bolt who's got a short femur, long tibia. I was quick, not fast. Okay? But we are measuring, you're looking at the femur relative to the tibia.
So it's per individual.
Per individual.
Yeah. I see. But are you applying a ratio if it comes really close? Are you looking at, well, the femur measures this length and the tibia measures this length, and then?
That's a good question. I think if they're within a quarter of an inch, they call it pretty much even.
Yeah. Yeah, I think half-inch longer than what we've found over the years. Then we would say that individual has a little longer femur, a little shorter tibia, and they might have some crossovers as well. I have an athlete who's a good 1-foot jumper and 2-foot jumpers. Your high jumpers typically have a long femur, short tibia. Okay? So they're going to transfer that horizontal force to vertical.
And then the long jumpers are just the opposite.
Short, long. The Carl Lewises, the sprinters.
Yeah.
Okay? Your Muay Thai kickers, Marco and Pedro.
Oh, short, long.
Short, long.
Short femur, long tibia.
Correct. Baseball pitchers with great velocity, long, short. Like a whip.
Over 3-inch difference.
Think of a whip. Long, humerus, shorter lower arm, and that whipping action. And again,
hold on.
Go ahead.
Oh, no. I was going to say, when you 3-inch difference, you mean 3-inch longer.
3-inch longer humerus than ulna.
So what sports with a short femur, long tibia? What sports would those people with those combo excel at, and what sports flipping that would accelerate at?
Great question. And I'll just add, we're not talking about fiber typing, right? Red twist, white twitch, glycolytic, anaerobic, just looking at levers. But our 25 years in doing this, typically your guys with short, long, you're going to have some speed. You're going to be sprinters, track. You're going to be probably a striker on the soccer pitch. Okay.
And long, short would be cyclists, guys that are quick feet, infielders, change of direction.
Oh, yeah. That's cool.
Wow. That is very cool.
What about Spencer that's short?
Well, we've seen Spencer. Spencer's very well developed and put together, so whatever he's doing, keep doing.
Thanks. I think they refer to that as a midget.
Yeah, but you're a Mighty Mouse. You're a stocky midget.
I will bring up this. This is a fascinating study. Guys with low clavicles typically have a very wide triangle trapezius base. And these guys take more concussive blows better than a guys with the high clavicle angle. Look at a quarterback, for example. Quarterbacks typically have a higher angle for overhead throwing, but their trap base is narrower.
Right.
They have higher percentages of concussions.
Mm.
Okay?
Hold
So,
on.
yeah.
You got it.
You just hit Spencer's button.
This is fantastic. Is it because of neck strength or I mean, muscle? Explain why you see that or what?
Well, again, I wish I had some pictures to show you, but if you look at an athlete with a 0-degree angle, maybe to a 3-degree,
Mike Tyson has a very low clavicle.
light clavicle angle. He's got a tremendous neck development. It's easier for him to develop that head strength, neck strength, trap, upper back strength. And therefore, his concussive blows are going to be handled much better with that structure than a guy with the high clavicle angle.
That is so cool. Yeah.
That's what we have found over the years.
Brilliant.
Fantastic. Wow, I did not expect that, but that makes a lot of sense because when concussion became the epidemic, there was discussion later on about for every increase in pound increase in strength of the neck is like a 5% reduction in potential for concussion, and it's but that was after years after the big problem. But man, if people would have known about this, clavicle angle seems to have such a impact in so many different areas.
It does. Yes, it really does. Pushing and pulling. Guys with these low clavicle angles are going to be very advantaged in pulling weight from the ground. So your deadlifters, guys who can clean, things like that. Your overhead lifting guys, it's going to be different. Everybody's got these different mechanical structural points. And the fun thing is to help people learn these, implement them, and watch what happens.
Any particular resources or networks or communities that you guys suggest especially for some of our listeners that are healthcare professionals, to connect with others that are practicing this way?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have some resources. There's a third edition of a strength anatomy book. I forget the author, but he's got some pictures in there about training based on your morphology. So there's more and more literature coming out. Again, they don't have a system to accurately reproduce these things, but that's a book that you can look at, strength anatomy, strength training anatomy. I know Mike Boyle has talked over the years about long femur and how guys with long femur can't squat. I had a gentleman, Aaron Wellman, called me up. He was the strength coach for New York Giants. We had a great discussion about the BioLever training system, and he had a very incredible analysis that he is doing for his athletes. But we had a good discussion, and this is a unique type. We really haven't brought this to the forefront yet. Dave and I are looking. We have an invitation to speak at some conventions, and we're going to start doing that. We have access to Gerald and David Riley. There's maybe a handful of guys that really has run with this over the past 25 years. We're fortunate to be two of those guys.
Awesome.
Yeah, I am surprised I haven't heard more about it because it seems very, very viable, and it's been around for a while, obviously.
Yeah.
So, gentlemen, we are entering this phase that we refer to rapid fire questions that require rapid fire answers. Either one of you could answer. There's 5 questions, or both of you could answer, and some of it has nothing to do with what we talked about, but it makes it a little more fun and real.
Sounds good.
Game on? Ready?
Yeah.
Okay, question number 1. If you could only recommend one unconventional health tip to your patients, what the heck would it be and why?
Learn to breathe properly. People don't breathe properly, so they have to learn how to do that.
It's great. We've had a couple of guests on that are experts in breath work. It's pretty fascinating. Very good. Very good. Number 2, what is the weirdest question a patient has ever asked you guys, and how did you respond?
Oh, wow. Are you breaking a bone when you hear the noise?
Oh, yeah.
Right. And you explain that that's not the case, and we're gapping the joint and synovial gas is leaving. And so you get that a lot of misconception about the adjustment.
I had a patient say, "Hey, Dr. Beatty, you look like you could rip my head off." I said, "That's only happened twice."
No.
They were worried.
That's
Good
awesome.
answer.
Awesome.
Good answer. Question number 3, Question number 3. If you had to swap roles with another healthcare professional for a day, just for a day, which profession would you choose and why?
Swap roles with another health profession.
Uh-huh.
Well, I would love to swap and have their ability a neurosurgeon.
Ooh.
I think that would be incredible because the nervous system is the key to everything.
And I would probably say a cardiologist, a cardiovascular surgeon, looking at the heart, that muscle that never stops.
Those are cool.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. Question number 4. What is your go-to self-care practice or maybe guilty pleasure when you need to unwind after a hectic day at work?
I get a Monster and go to the mountain.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I've got a 150-pound dog called a Borble. His name is Leonidas.
Oh my.
And I have a Borble, and I take this guy in my backyard. We make a fire, and we just look at each other for about 30 minutes, and we unwind.
I have goosebumps. That is the most phenomenal animal that I've ever seen in real life.
Yeah.
Because they're meant to kill lions.
Well, they were trained to defend farms from lions, hyenas, and baboons.
These, I treated a bunch of athletes on a recovery night at one of their homes, and there was something pounding on the other side of a bedroom door, and I go, "What the hell is that?" And the other players go, "Man, you don't want to know." And I go, "Well, now I really want to know." He opened the door, and it's the biggest. It didn't even look like a dog. It's the biggest dog I've ever seen in my entire life. Terry, you got to pull it up.
Well, we got. Hey, you got to send us a picture of your dog so we can put it in the YouTube video.
Yeah,
I will.
Yeah.
I have the Borble, and David has 2 Presa Canarios, and they're tiger stripes, so they're crazy as well.
I was waiting for you to say that David
you guys
has a
are very
Pekingese
safe.
and you have the big ass dog. Yeah.
No, he's got 2. I have 1.
Yeah, no,
Well, I'm gonna have to look this dog up now because is that one of those big monster like?
They're both Mastiff breeds. His is from the Canary Islands, and mine's from South Africa.
Yeah, mine has gotten a reputation with the NFL players, so a lot of players in the NFL have the Presas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are they good with other dogs and other people, or you have to hold them back?
If the other dog is not dominant, otherwise they'll probably kill it.
Where mine, the Borble, his nature is, I mean, if there's somebody there and he's been trained, he'll get after it. But his nature is really, really gentle and kind, and but he's going to allow you to come into his house.
Got it. You have to actually introduce people to the dog when they come into the house.
Yes.
Huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
The player that owned this dog was like a 300 or 275 pound offensive lineman, and he had to give up the dog because he couldn't handle it. He couldn't handle the dog. But again, he probably didn't train it well like you did.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I got a thrill from that one. Question number 5 and the last one. Would you rather have the ability to instantly heal any physical injury or illness, but never be able to diagnose the cause, or have an unmatched diagnosis skill, but no ability to
heal all the way? Heal.
You
That
know,
was easy.
That movie Cocoon, where we could jump into a pool of water and be 25 again. I mean, the effects of aging has its toll, and And health is our greatest asset, is it not?
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. I asked that question to people in different healthcare professions, without naming them, more on the pharmaceutical side, and their answers were switched. They'd rather be able to diagnose. So it's interesting that the chiropractor, even some of the therapists, they didn't care about the diagnosis. They just wanted to heal. So it was interesting.
Heal.
Yeah.
The body is meant to heal.
Where do you see this instrumentation going? I mean, yes, it's a big machine. Do you see with technology nowadays that it can get to a point where you can have an app on your cell phone and just scan the person and have all the information there?
That's a great question. I think we're headed toward that, Dr. Terry. I don't know what it's going to take, but I think in the future, if you could have an app on your computer, that could do some scanning, this could be incredible.
Yeah, it's really unlimited because the 4 categories are performance, rehab, prevention, and just lifestyle. If a guy's got a low clavicle angle, I'm going to not have him painting up here. I'm going to move a ladder up high so he's painting in front.
Right.
Little things like that.
I mean, isn't there a way that they could take their shirt off? You could take with cell phones and cameras now that you could take a picture and you could draw those lines. And it doesn't seem like
we've gotten really good over the years just by looking at people. Yeah. So
we'll have to talk to Gerald and David about it, but certainly it's moving in that direction.
That's so awesome. I mean, how advantage would that be? Just looking at stuff from both a prevention, a preseason, a season, a postseason training. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Big. I love it. All right. Well, gentlemen, that was really fantastic. I absolutely appreciate you imparting that knowledge base that I've completely been unfamiliar with, and how effective it is in the identification of potential injuries and in rehabilitation. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure, Dr. Flurry and Dr. Spencer. Thank you.
It's always nice showing off brains and their friends. So not only do I appreciate your friendship, but I appreciate your knowledge. So thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Crackin Backs Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you follow us on Instagram at Crackin Backs Podcast. Catch new episodes every Monday. See you next time.